When the film Civil War was announced, I was curious to know what perspective would be brought to the concept. The United States has experienced quite a bit of turmoil over the past 12 years, including strides toward equality marked by the election of the first black president, LGBTQ+ marriage and civil protections, and the Black Lives Matter protests for police reform. But for every stride forward, it seems we took 2 steps back in the form of the massive reemergence of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, the repopularization of traditional gender roles, as well as the January 6th terrorist event. The country had reached a boiling point, having narrowly avoided a possibly devastating event that may have ended in the loss of elected representatives and a huge blow to the republic. In the following years after January 6, 2021, the dialogue shifted to conversations about insurrection, regime change, and coup d'etat. However, just as the news surrounding the event began to cool down and a new election would soon be underway, A24 announced that they would be releasing a film called Civil War. Fortunately or unfortunately, Civil War fails to commit to its premise as a film that would depict an alternative future United States based on the country's current political landscape. As a result of the film's failure to commit to its controversial origins, the resulting work fails on multiple axes. The film Civil War is about a group of journalists who travel from New York to Washington, D.C. to interview the president before a separatist group closes in on the city, determining once and for all if there will be a United States. Along the way, they bear witness to the different ways that people have survived in a divided country and reflect on their part as recorders of history. Civil War fails to deliver a satisfying story or display strong characterization. Despite having brought in talent such as Nick Offerman, Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moura, Stephen McKinley Henderson, and the child from the Bad Times at the El Royale, the film is unable to balance the all-American road trip, the found family narrative, the stories of its characters, the intrigue of its setting, and make it look decent. Civil War attempts to put on a show for its audience by spinning each of these plates in the air, but ultimately makes a fool of itself by dropping them all, shattering them on the ground unceremoniously. What starts as a story focused on a photojournalist played by Kirsten Dunst and her partner in journalism, Joel, who are looking to travel from New York to DC to interview the president, quickly becomes an intergenerational all-American road trip movie, with veteran of the journalism game Sammy joining in, along with the young and ambitious photojournalist Jesse, who apparently has nowhere to be and no reason to be in New York. In Civil War, the way people get together feels especially contrived. Lee saves Jesse during a conflict between police guarding an EPA water truck and the resource-deprived people of the area. Later, Lee and Joel are joined by Sammy in New York during a party, and Lee explains to Sammy their plan to interview the president and to be present for one of the final battles taking place in Charlottesville, and Sammy asks for a ride. The next morning, Joel reveals that, in the drunken haze of the night before, he offered Jesse a ride as well. Essentially, everyone gets together within the first 15 minutes of the film with very little conflict other than Lee feeling that the character played by that girl from Bad Times at the El Royale, Callie Spaney, is too young to make this dangerous journey. It's easy to imagine a version of this film that better balances the all-American road trip with its characters and setting.
Time to nut up or shut up.
The reason that the core group of characters get together in Civil War is just that they're sitting around a table at a party drinking and decide to go to the same place. The only action set piece that functions to bring them together is the one where Lee meets the little girl from Bad Times at the El Royale. However, the majority of the party already knows each other from a time that is not seen on camera, and we barely see them reminisce. And when they do, there are no visual flashbacks where we get insight into their lives before the end times. The film does a disservice to the viewer by throwing everyone in the car together so quickly. The result leaves us with a group of characters that it's impossible to be attached to. We know little about them as individuals, and even less about how they interact with one another, which makes it harder to invest ourselves in their character arcs. To be blunt, where there are character arcs in Civil War, they feel incoherent and unpleasant to experience. It is clear that director-writer Alex Garland has dropped the first bomb of his career with this film, which is okay. No one gets it right every time. However, I expected more from the man that directed and wrote Annihilation and Ex Machina. In Civil War, each member of the group has something they want to achieve that has placed them in the press van. But whether or not their difficult experiences on the road facilitate noticeable change within them is arguable. Sammy, the wise old black man who represents the old guard, asks for a ride because he wants to be present for the battle in Charlottesville, no matter the risk. He just can't resist the prospect of being present for the story of a lifetime. That being said, there isn't much to Sammy. Throughout the film, he condemns Lee's cold attitude, makes remarks about their honorable profession, and subtly compares the new United States to the United States before the war. But his character arc really just comes down to irony. Lee points out that when they arrive in Charlottesville, it'll be a war zone, and warns Sammy that he might die there due to his age and lack of mobility. Later in the film, Lee and Joel decide to approach two men in military fatigues dumping dead bodies, against Sammy's warning that these events could lead to their deaths. Obviously, the situation turns sour, but Sammy saves the day by driving the press van directly into the action, but doesn't survive the rescue effort. To put it simply, Lee says that Sammy might die because he's unfit to handle the dangers of the journey. But, ironically, he would not have died if he hadn't saved the rest of the group from their own bad decision making. Sammy appears to be an experienced professional and a caring person, and he dies just as he lived, with no on-screen character development. Let's pivot to Joel. Joel is a print journalist who wants to interview the president. No one knows if the president is still alive or if the broadcasts of him speaking are pre-recorded messages, but Joel is determined to get his story. When the film opens, Joel is shown to be the thrill seeker of the group, who doesn't seem to take life or death particularly seriously, even in the worst of times. He's often seen smoking a cigarette, holding a vodka bottle, and smiling brightly. Regardless of the danger, Joel wants to chase the story and is shown to be aroused by the violence, as it offers him the excitement he craves. However, when his friends die at the hands of two military men revealed to hold bigoted beliefs about what makes an American, he finally feels impacted by the violence. We see that compounded by his disbelief that Sammy is wounded after the encounter. Joel expresses anger that Sammy died in vain when he learns that they missed the Charlottesville battle and the surrender of the Loyalist forces. During the final battle, Joel converses with another journalist who is excited to document what he calls the money shot, where the Western forces will kill the president. Joel, however, no longer feels the same excitement he used to at the thought of documenting this event, seemingly a different man than the one we saw at the start of the movie. Presumably, it is that feeling of purposelessness that pushes him to get the president's last words after the death of Lee. That being said, it does leave the viewer feeling unsettled, like Joel hasn't learned the value of life. Because when Lee dies, he keeps moving and doesn't spare her even a moment. Lee is in the van because she wants to capture images of Joel interviewing the president and the battle between the Loyalist and Western forces in Charlottesville if they get there in time. She begins the film not wanting to be responsible for the deaths of others and being dedicated to, but losing faith in, journalism, which the film views as the unbiased recording of history. She ends the film breaking down in the middle of the final battle, overwhelmed by the uselessness of her role amidst the violence. She feels helpless on the battlefield, lost again in the destruction that brought about the death of her friend and colleague. This brings to mind a key moment for Lee, when she is questioned by Jesse about whether or not she would photograph her dying moments or save her if she was injured in the war zone. Lee responds coldly, asking, "What do you think?" At the film's end, Lee gets killed saving Jesse as some sort of penance, as Jesse follows in the steps of her mentor by photographing Lee's final moments. Yada yada, the cycle of violence continues, and Lee has fully lost faith in journalism and has decided that it is her responsibility to participate to prevent more death. However, if you think about the scene in the totality of Dunst's time on screen, you'll remember that Lee was concerned about Jesse's safety from the first time she saw her, when she got hit in the head by a cop at the start of the film. Moreover, Lee checks on Jesse and protects her by covering her body with her own before a bomb goes off. Despite the character's tough exterior, she has been the same character throughout the film. She has not changed. Jessie enters the van because she wants to do war photography like her idol Lee. Jessie feels that joining the journalists on their journey will get her closer to the action, closer to her goal of sharpening her craft, and give her ample opportunity to take photos of the historic events she seeks to capture. Jessie experiences events on the road that shock her into forgetting to photograph, but learns from Lee to harden herself, engage with the subjects, and get the necessary shots. Jessie learns to detach herself, that it's not her job to pass judgment on the events taking place, but instead to simply document. During the final battle in Washington, D.C., we find that Joel's thrill-seeker outlook has rubbed off on Jessie, as she is energized by the action. But that excitement is short-lived. The moment her mentor dies in front of her, and she captures her last moments instead of trying to help is when Jesse becomes a war-scarred journalist. However, once again, it's easy to forget that we never see Jesse reflecting on or passing judgment on any of the events that she seeks to immortalize on film. Jesse is never portrayed as being too scared to be in the midst of the action, that she has to view events from the safety of the sidelines. She photographs more confidently by the end of the film and is more skilled at navigating active areas, but even at the start of the film, she was bold enough to jump into the thick of the conflict between police and civilians, getting so close that she got whacked in the head. By the end of the film, Jessie is not more bold than she was at the start. She has changed slightly, but for the worse. In the end, Jessie becomes a traumatized war photographer, destined to follow the exact same path as her mentor. She embraces the lesson that Lee defied in her last moments about being an uninvolved recorder of history, as she doesn't try to help her and quickly moves on from her death. These so-called arcs leave the audience with a mixed message. We can't really tell what the film has to say about the role journalists have in society. Is it that they are the criminals dividing America by purporting to be objective? Or is it that they are the heroes that should be revered for their impartiality and willingness to put themselves in harm's way to document history so that we may possibly learn from it? The film does not take a stance, and in the end, Jesse and Joel don't go out of their way to help Lee, or anyone else for that matter, before the credits roll. It seems like Garland has mistaken incoherence for ambiguity. The main trouble with Civil War is that the characters and story only really exist to show off its lackluster setting, which it believes is a searing critique of journalism and America's political landscape. The story of Civil War is that one of the 5 groups that the United States has been divided into, called the Western Forces, is fighting to take as much territory as they can with the goal of taking over the nation's capital. Our intrepid group of journalists are looking to be present at any battles they believe will be historic moments, so they can record those events. On their road trip, they have encounters in the mid-Atlantic where small groups of people are fighting one another for reasons unknown. There's death around nearly every corner in Civil War, and where the characters find no death, they find isolation. One early encounter takes place at a gas station. The group drives up to find men with large guns guarding the station. They're asked if they have a fuel permit. To get around it, they haggle for 300 Canadian dollars. This solely exists to show the viewer that the American dollar means nothing at this time. The difficulty that I have with this setting is that only for a single moment do you think that the people at the gas station might cause harm to the group. After the money is offered and exchanged, there's no feeling of desperation that the folks running the gas station might just kill them and steal their money, car, and supplies, as folks might be tempted to do if things were truly desperate. Even when Jesse walks off and finds looters strung up in the back of the car wash, we get a sense of this world's savagery when we learn that the guy torturing them knew one of the looters back when they attended high school together. However, the movie fails to take it one step further, possibly because these are the loyalist states, or possibly because of Garland's lack of imagination. If the setting was truly unforgiving, why would the gas station attendant imply that they would kill the looters or let them go while they're bloodied and hung up in the back of the car wash? I'm not certain that Garland even considered America's well-documented brutality that their bodies could be displayed in the front of the gas station to deter future looters. Something that wouldn't be too out of place in a series like The Purge, The Walking Dead, or the aftermath of an American Civil War. The next encounter finds the group in an active war zone in an abandoned building. The group they are following has the lower ground, and there's a man who is stuck hiding for cover but runs the risk of being shot if he leaves. His allies attempt to get him to a safer area by using smoke bombs and firing back at their enemies, but ultimately he is fatally wounded. Lee and Jesse take photos throughout the encounter that emphasize the fact that images alone cannot capture the grisly reality of the events taking place. The camera flashes between the still frames of the violence and the reality of the man bleeding out as his ally attempts to save him. Ultimately, the fighters are able to get the jump on their enemies, and when it's over, they kill them via firing squad. Who's fighting who? The movie doesn't tell and doesn't expect us to care, because it supposedly doesn't matter when there's death all around. But the scene goes from heavy to cartoonish as Say No Go by De La Soul plays as the group witnesses the violent aftermath of the raid. The group find a slice of normalcy when they enter Pittsburgh and are greeted by the perfect image of suburbia. People going on walks, perfectly manicured lawns, and kids' toys out on the grass. They enter a shop where they are greeted by the shopkeeper who lets them know that, while they're aware of the violence, folks in Pittsburgh have decided to separate themselves from the larger war. The group has some fun, trying on clothes and hats in the store until Sammy points out that there are snipers on top of the buildings. Pittsburgh protects its peace using the threat of violence. Sammy and Lee agree that while it's pleasant, it doesn't suit them, silently agreeing that while Pittsburgh may look like the pre-war US, it simply isn't. At this moment, the journalists say they're leaving because they'd be bored living in such a peaceful town. But in reality, they are not ready to accept any version of America that doesn't have the exact same freedoms to which they are accustomed. They have trepidations about trading in freedom for security, a difference in values compared to the store clerk and the other people in Pittsburgh that are never seen nervously looking at the tops of the buildings, although they know that's how they stay out of the conflict. While this has nothing to do with the characters being journalists, this is the best example of the movie bringing to life something genuine about how a piece of America might change and how some cities might take action to ensure order and preserve their way of life. After leaving Pittsburgh, the group drives up to an abandoned golf course, where they see the dead body of a man in camouflage in the middle of the road. Sammy suggests going back a few miles and taking a different route to get to Charlottesville. However, Joel decides to push forward slowly, leading the group to being shot at by an unknown assailant. Joel dives behind a truck for cover, and the group finds two men in camouflage that have been in a standoff with the unseen assailant. When Joel attempts to speak to the men about who they represent, who they're fighting, and why, the men reply that they don't know and don't care. They're shooting at the unseen guy in the house because he's shooting at them, not for any lofty political goal. The problem is, it would actually be helpful to know who they're fighting or who they represent, if anyone. The movie treats violence for violence sake as a given. The men treat Joel as though he is silly for asking on account of how there's chaos everywhere. However, the reason why someone might kill people who are theoretically no harm to them from a distance could be anything from paranoia about safety to relishing in murder in a world with no consequences. Regarding the two men, it would be helpful to know any information about them, how long they've been there, how many people they've lost, or even if they've defected from representing one side in particular. In this instance, the film goes out of its way to have a character ask questions that the viewer would want to know and chooses to insult the viewer for even asking. As they near Charlottesville, the group engages in a road race with two of Joel's journalist friends, Tony and Bohai. During the race, Jesse and Bohai get separated, and when catching up, the group finds their abandoned car, which leads them to a farm by a river. Through Lee's camera lens, she is able to spot Jesse and Bohai standing with two men in army fatigues that are dumping dead bodies from the back of a work truck into a mass grave. Sammy points out that they are in a dangerous situation because those two men do not want to be seen doing what they're doing. The bodies in the back of the truck are not in uniform, and the two men may be facilitating extrajudicial killings or just flat out murdering people. He tries to express that if they approach the men, they may be killed. However, his words fall on deaf ears as Joel, Lee, and Tony approach the men in hopes of reconnecting with their friends. The closest Civil War gets to being political is in this moment. Joel informs the men that he and his companions are all journalists, but one of the men decides to kill Bohai regardless. He questions the group, asking where they're from to determine whether they ought to live or die. Jesse replies, Missouri, Lee, Colorado, and Joel, Florida, but Tony mistakenly states Hong Kong, clearly reeling from the death of his friend, and is immediately killed. The two men express distaste for the fact that Joel is a South American guy from Florida as tensions continue to rise. But before the gun goes off, the truck drives through, knocking Jesse and the two men back. Sammy yells at them to get back in the van. A shocked Jessie has to crawl her way out of the pit of dead bodies to rejoin the group. They drive off in shock and horror, only to find that it's not over, as Sammy was fatally wounded in the escape, which parallels the man in the war zone who could not be saved by his allies. This is the point where the film pays lip service to ideology, but that might be a stretch also, seeing as how the cheesy bigots seem more concerned with frankly trivial knowledge of geography, asking Jesse fun facts about Missouri instead of anything substantial. Essentially, the characters the group encounter have a very conservative idea of who, quote, belongs in America. These bigots don't honor their role as journalists, and they seem eager to kill the characters of color who they deem un-American. But Even so, we know nothing about the people being buried in the mass grave, or if the two men are working alone or with others who share their bigoted beliefs. It's understandable that the characters weren't able to engage with the two bigots in a meaningful way, but it feels like there's something missing overall because the other battle scenes have fallen flat. This otherwise impactful scene leaves the viewer with more questions than answers, with only a half hour left in the movie. The group reached Charlottesville and discovered the Loyalists gave up the fight, leaving the Western forces to move in on DC and declare their victory. And so, we come to the last big set piece, a showdown at the White House. The threesome enters the White House after the Western forces bust through the barrier. The Western forces clear the way, but just before they reach the Oval Office, a Secret Service member comes down the hallway, ready to open fire, as Jessie stands in the middle of the hall taking photos. Lee lurches forward, choosing finally to engage with the history she spent her adult life documenting. She pushes Jessie to the ground, saving her life and taking the bullet for her. Jessie photographs her as she is shot and falls to the ground, dead. Joel, determined to ensure that no one has died in vain on their journey, tries to shake Jessie out of her shock before leaving her behind to do what he has desired to do from the beginning: interview the president. Once Jessie shakes out of her stupor, she spares her mentor one last glance before moving forward to document what is to be the president's last moments. The president addresses his last words to Joel, gets photographed by Jessie, and meets his end at the hands of the Western forces, who all smile for a photo as the credits roll. It would be easy to say this scene feels lackluster, as it takes place in a space that is obviously not Washington, D.C., with empty storefronts, zero signage, and a giant wall surrounding what is supposed to be 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. If I could be positive here for just a second, what really makes this scene hard to watch is the feeling that Jessie has learned all the wrong lessons from Lee. She coldly documents her death and leaves her lying in the White House corridor instead of attempting anything close to a rescue effort. On the whole, though, the film's cynicism is deeply annoying. No one learned a thing. The film's conclusion is that we are all fucked, and that there's nothing we can do about it other than dream, baby, dream. Garland thinks these scenes are more damning than they are. But they aren't, because they aren't indicative of the reasons why America fell. We don't see a conservative town versus a liberal town. We don't see any hallmarks of an ideology in any of the locations through which the journalists pass, political, religious, or otherwise. Garland does not give us a visual of how each of the 5 factions would cultivate their towns and societies after the United States has been divided. In fact, the whole world feels empty, soulless, and not at all lived in. There's never a moment when a destroyed route slows the characters down, forces them to get out and move cars out of the way, or when anything happens that would force them to abandon their vehicle. There's one moment when they have to weave through abandoned cars on the highway, but as a whole, the drive itself is actually relatively smooth. We see military checkpoints, but their drives are largely uninhibited, leaving the world to feel more orderly and organized than your traditional post-apocalyptic setting. Additionally, there aren't even enough soldiers on the road for it to feel like the loyalist states in which the film takes place are military or police states. It's surprising that the violence in the film is shown to be without motive, while the United States itself exists within hyper-political times. Garland seems to believe that violence on its own is scary, especially if it's in your neck of the woods. But the film provides no reason for why the violence is occurring, and no insight into what kind of world each faction sees as ideal, and thus leaves its premise high and dry. Even in Lee's flashbacks to earlier in the war, when we see images of people running, fighting, and being immolated, there's no context given to those images. We have no idea what side these people are on or what their individual stories are, which creates a sense of emptiness and senselessness around the violence. On one hand, some viewers may find this scary and even hard to watch, but it doesn't provide insight into who is fighting and why. It says nothing about what divides American people, what belief systems brushed up against one another and led to widespread conflict, or even who started the violence. Even the concept of war bad does not strengthen the film. War is hell. We get it. But in this film, we are not following civilians. We are following war journalists who are, by and large, interacting with combatants and other members of the press, all of whom voluntarily place themselves in danger to record history or be a part of it. We are not following everyday people, which makes it hard to get an understanding as a viewer of how Garland feels that average citizens would be impacted by such events. There are only 3 images of daily life in the divided states of America in the entire movie. We get the people at the start of the film who are begging the EPA for water, the people of Pittsburgh living peacefully but under the silent threat of violence, and we get a UNICEF-like camp the journalists stop at where we see people with campers and children playing outside. Across each of these locations, the group only really interacts with one civilian, the store clerk in Pittsburgh, which results in the viewer not knowing how to place themselves into this vision of the future. Moreover, the threat of violence we see these journalists experience is largely incidental. Typically, when we see them in the midst of violence, people don't want to harm them because of their status as journalists. You can decide what you think that's worth in a combat zone. It's almost as if our main characters are some sort of protected class, which makes it hard to see them as possible victims of the violence they record. It's also important to note that journalists do not have an elevated status in the US, apart from the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner. In fact, the current political landscape has many people on both sides of the aisle dissatisfied with current reporting trends on a number of political issues. As newspapers and television stations are being bought out by corporations with their own agendas, see Sinclair Broadcast Group and Bezos' Washington Post, Americans are seeing more skewed reporting and are increasingly skeptical of what they see and read. It's hard to imagine that American journalists would be afforded such respect, especially after a civil war that has divided America based on unspecified ideological differences. Sidebar, let's talk about that fucking map. The film is fully uninterested in America as a whole. The characters discuss that there are separatist states that have chosen to secede from the Union, and then make mention of divided areas, such as the Western Forces and the Loyalist states. However, in order to get the full context of the film, you needed to pay attention to the marketing, something A24 prides itself on. Prior to the movie's release, A24 presented a map of the divided United States that included the Republic of California, the Second Republic of Texas, the Western Forces, the Loyalist states, and the Florida Alliance. However, the film itself only takes place in the Mid-Atlantic region, where somehow the Loyalist states are brushing up against the Western Forces. The map presented shows the Western Forces on the leftmost side from Oregon to Minnesota, and the Loyalist states being through the middle of the country from Nevada to South Carolina and up through the Northeast states to Maine. There are a number of reasons why this does not make sense. The obvious geographical implications, of course, but more importantly, the fact that America has a number of complex regional cultures and the lines between states are not as solid as they appear on a map. The idea that values vary from state to state doesn't get taken into consideration. Surely, the people of West Virginia have significantly different values than the people of New York, and yet those individuals are in the same Loyalist states. The map itself has made so little sense to US residents that many have tried to remake it based on their understandings of the cultures and values that exist within the US. The map is emblematic of a larger issue, which is that American regional cultures and subcultures are not displayed within the film. Civil war could have honestly taken place in any country and remained the same story. The only difference is the amount of guns. I credit this to Garland, Brit that he is, not having a clear understanding of the complex regional cultures of the United States. That being said, there's literally no excuse for not looking up a political map of the US and attempting to craft your story at least based on that. In an attempt to be taken seriously as a war film, Civil War chooses a color palette mostly of grays, browns, and greens to evoke thoughts of war footage. It has what I have been calling the lifeless grayish approach to filmmaking. This approach feels out of place for a film ostensibly set in an alternative future. The result is a muddy film that looks like it's supposed to have taken place in an older time. Although the intent may have been to show that war never changes from country to country, century to century, and to bring to mind memories of war footage in lands abroad, what it really does is fail to show something new and contextualize war in the 21st century. Anyone tuned into the news can look up war footage from Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and many other places around the world and see it in high definition. You can even see war footage on your phone. Anyone with a smartphone can open Snapchat and see stories from people in those regions in fairly high quality. The thought of someone looking at war footage on the news on their 4K TV in their living room and saying, war looks like desaturated footage and black and white photos, feels juvenile and quite frankly, silly. it means nothing, and in some scenes, it makes it hard for the audience to find a focal point when the entire screen is awash in nearly identical earth tones. I was shocked when I found out that the DP for this film was Garland's go-to cinematographer, Rob Hardy, who's responsible for striking images in Annihilation and Ex Machina, as I previously mentioned, 2 films he made with Garland that I find to demonstrate mastery of his craft. Comparing the dull visuals, black and white photos, and fire-laden forests filled with Adobe After Effects to his previous work really shows that this work does not reflect his identity as a cinematographer. The choice to make Civil War look like your typical grayish old-school war film was a mistake. It doesn't make the story any deeper, and it doesn't make the world feel any more real. Civil War fails as a critique of the American political landscape because it succeeds at avoiding anything overtly political. As a result, Civil War is useless in the cultural context from which its premise is drawn. If you are interested in alternative history media, I've got a short list for you. 1. Man in the High Castle. This hour-long series presents a future where the Axis powers won World War II and America is divided by Germany and Japan. I really loved the blend of political drama with science fiction. Also, if you're into world building, as a TV show, it has time to get into the nitty-gritty of daily life, but still have spy thrills. I only saw the first 2 seasons, but watching Civil War twice for this essay has inspired me to go back and watch the whole thing. 2. 11/22/63. It's an alternative history where James Franco plays a high school teacher who goes back in time to stop the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on a Stephen King novel, it's 1 season long, and it's awesome. I really enjoyed the look and feel of everything. It's also a terrific romantic drama, and the sci-fi's great too. You really feel the impact of Franco's successes and failures, and you get invested in both the main character's mission and his life. 3. Believe it or not, give the Purge TV series a shot. It's an alternative future that is actually political. While it starts with the film concept of murder being legal 1 day a year, the TV series builds on that idea by showing the ways that a day where all crimes are legal might shape religion, governance, and interpersonal relationships. I recently rewatched the beginning and was quite shocked that it was so gripping considering it had to meet broadcast censorship standards. 4. Snowpiercer. If you're into alternative history narratives or sci-fi in general, you've probably already seen this Bong Joon-ho joint. But if you haven't, it's so good. Essentially, the Earth is going through an ice age and the people on this train are supposedly the only people left alive. The class system has been recreated on this train from back to front. The most enjoyable thing about Snowpiercer is that it's a film about revolution and the social order, starring a grungier, more destitute Captain America. If you have not already seen it, you're in for one hell of a ride. 5. The New American Wasteland. I have to recommend this podcast by veteran Monty Ho because it does everything that Civil War couldn't do. Monty Ho and his community have worked together to develop a painstakingly detailed picture of what America would look like in 2035 as a nation divided. It follows the stories of survivors across a divided America, following a series of domestic conflicts between fundamentalist extremists and progressive militias. These conflicts, exacerbated by climate change and the federal government's inability to hold its territory, led to a fractured nation where each nation within the wasteland has its own culture and problems. While I'm not active in his community, I can proudly say that I was one of his first online patrons and honestly could not be happier about where this project has gone. The episodes can be dark and deeply disturbing depending on the episode, but Monty does an excellent job at writing and voicing the tales of the US post-Civil War. Alright, I've given you 5 pieces of alternative history media, and I've explained to you my perspective on Civil War. Like and subscribe if you found this interesting and if you want to hear more. If you've seen it, what did you think of Civil War? And what's your favorite piece of alternative history or future media? Let me know in the comments below. Okay, bye.